Amanda James Myers. Today we're going to continue with the reading of my book, Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology, which was originally published in 1988. We're beginning with part 2, Avoiding Nihilism in Favor of Growth. This chapter is Optimal Psychology and the Transpersonal Paradigm. The reality we perceive is shaped by an underlying system of beliefs, often implicit, assumed, or unquestioned, which serves as a self-fulfilling, self-prophetic organizer of experience. From this basis, all psychologies have evolved as implicit or explicit models of human nature. The pervasive dynamic interplay between cultural beliefs and psychological models must be recognized. The models posed by psychologists are part of their beliefs and experiences and reflect the individual and the culture that produced them. All human beings bring meaning. All human beings bring meaning to their words through their underlying perceptual filters or deep structures, also called conceptual systems as we refer to them. They organize consciousness for us. 3 schools of thought predominate in Western psychology: the psychoanalytic, propagated by Sigmund Freud; behavioristic, propagated by B.F. Skinner; and the humanistic. Abraham Maslow was a forerunner. Each declares its views on nature. Each declares its views on the nature of humankind. Freudian theory, in particular, the psychoanalytic school, emphasizes the reduction of universal and inevitable drives. Freud saw sex and aggression as the 2 of the most powerful forces, as the primary focus of personality, function, and development. The behaviorists emphasize the mechanistic view of man, in which behavior is a function of innate or learned drives or of the controlling environmental contingencies of reward and punishment. The humanists concern themselves with the human capacities and potentials that have no systematic place in the behavior and psychoanalytic theory. For example, creativity, self, growth, basic need gratification, higher values, autonomy, identity, responsibility, psychological health, and so on. Their aim is to present a more specific picture of the full range of possibilities inherent in the nature of humankind and how these possibilities can be actualized. After a quarter of a century, the humanities identified their status in the field of psychology as critical, that is, at a point of crisis. Less than 1% of the membership of the American Psychological Association explicitly agrees with the values proposed by humanistic psychology. And intra-movement differences are just as predominant among mainstream psychologists. According to George, it is known that the term humanistic now has negative connotations: the promise of developing human potential, metapsychological understanding, and new, more creative, adequate, yet rigorous research strategies have not yet been realized. George adds that any explanation of the crisis in humanistic psychology must recognize that culture embraces a science and technology that affirms the inherent limitations of its belief system. Indeed, perennial crises of traditional Western psychology is that it does not recognize the problem that the meaning of science is ascribed by culture. What we need then is an authentic psychology of the human being, an optimal psychology that connects measurable manifestations with the intuitive and rational belief systems of observers of human experience. Looking beyond humanistic psychology, Abraham Maslow pointed to a still fourth higher psychology, beyond humanist identity, self-actualization, and the like, a transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology seeks to expand the field of psychological inquiry to include the study of optimal psychological health and well-being. The potential for experiencing a broad range of states of consciousness is recognized, allowing identity to extend beyond the usual limits of ego and personality. Benefiting from exposure to cross-cultural beliefs about the nature of consciousness and reality, transpersonal psychology would seem to present a paradigm shift in Western psychology, changing prevailing limiting cultural beliefs about our basic nature and our relationship to the world. Recognizing these upper reaches of psychological development would support an investigation of maximally positive well-being and higher states of consciousness. This awareness has always been characteristic of non-Western psychologies. The failure of materialistic external strivings to provide peace and well-being has led to a search for more adequate constructs. This awareness has always been characteristic of non-Western psychologies. The failure of materialistic external strivings to provide peace and well-being has led to The failure of materialistic external strivings to provide peace and well-being has led to a need to search for more adequate constructs. One of the aims of transpersonal psychology must be to help us overcome the perceptual distortions identified by so many and so much as consciousness disciplines and move us to a view of reality that is consistent with what modern physics suggests is the true nature of the universe. Recognizing these upper reaches of psychological development would support an investigation of maximal positive well-being and higher stages of human consciousness. This awareness has always been characteristic of non-Western psychologies. The failure of materialistic external strivings to provide peace and well-being has led to a search for more adequate constructs. One of the aims of transpersonal psychology must be to help us overcome the perceptual distortions identified by so many as consciousness disciplines and move us to a view of reality that is consistent with what modern physics suggests is the true nature of the universe. This may be one of the most important tasks confronting psychology today. To the extent that only a small number of Western psychologists support a humanistic view, the number dwindles even further when we look for those who support the transpersonal perspective. It is obvious that transpersonal psychology is not well understood or appreciated in Western culture. The American Psychological Association overwhelmingly rejected a proposal to create within the organization a division of transpersonal psychology. Its concerns were based in part on the fear that in considering the transpersonal, any negative aspects of human behavior and experience would be leaped across, and that confusion would develop over religion versus psychology. As you and I can see, the core of the issue lies in the conceptual limitations that characterize the worldview of most psychologists and the lay community in our society. In a discussion in the modern Western mindset, Smith describes an epistemology that aims relentlessly at control, ruling out the possibility of transcendence in principle, theory, and practice. The American Psychological Association overwhelmingly rejected a proposal to create within its organization a division of transpersonal psychology. Its concerns were based in part, first, on the fear that in considering the transpersonal, any negative aspect of human behavior and experience would be leaped across, and that confusion would develop over religion versus psychology. As you and I can see, the core of the issue lies in the conceptual limitations that characterize the worldviews of most psychologists in the West and the lay community in our society. In a discussion of the modern Western mindset, Smith describes an epistemology that aims relentlessly at control, ruling out the possibility of transcendence in principle, theory, and practice. The missing link. In its search for a paradigm, conspicuously absent in the literature of transpersonal psychology is an exploration of traditional African culture and worldview. This legacy of omission demonstrates that until recently, because of the imposition of the Western conceptual system in its analysis, African culture has been misunderstood. The framework of the unity and integration of knowledge that we seek in a transpersonal paradigm already exists in the African worldview and is identified in Afrocentric psychological theory. A cursory review of 10 years of literature of the Professional Journal of Transpersonal Psychology reveals, for the most part, a search for a paradigm on Asiatic Oriental philosophy and modern physics, but Copra notes neither approach has offered clear implications for applicability to today experience. This limitation appears to be a function of the conceptual system or conceptual worldview constraining the culture from which these fields of study are interpreted. The modern physicist experiences the world through an extreme specialization of the rational, the mystic through an extreme specialization of the intuitive mind. If this is true, what is missing is the extreme specialization of the rational intuitive mind, which is what the Afrocentric worldview has to offer. According to Copra, the mystical experience is necessary to understand the deepest nature of things. The science is essential for modern life. What we need, states Copra, is not a synthesis, but a dynamic interplay between the mystical intuition and scientific analysis. The worldview implied by modern physics is inconsistent with the predominant worldview of our society, which does not reflect the harmonious relationships, the harmonious interrelationships observable in nature. The worldview implied by modern physics is inconsistent with the predominant worldview of our society, which does not reflect the harmonious interrelationships observable in nature. To achieve such a state of dynamic balance, a radically different philosophical, social, and economic structure, a cultural revolution in the truest sense, is needed. The survival of our civilization may depend on whether or not we can bring about such a change. Some of the components of such a cultural revolution can be seen in Afrocentrism, from whose balance of the rational intuitive energies the epistemology of optimal psychology emerges. Accordingly, Copra's initial premise reflects on the inherent snare of a suboptimal segmented worldview and the dichotomy he identifies in its own contradiction. What kind of science does not speak to understand the deepest nature of things and is yet essential to modern life? Copra speaks of Newtonian science. Characteristic of Western thought, Newtonian science is limited by the constraints of a faulty ontological premise. Accordingly, Copra's initial premise reflects the inherent snare of a suboptimal segmented worldview and the dichotomy he identifies is its own contradiction. What kind of science does not speak to understand the deepest of things, the deepest nature of things, and is yet essential to modern life? Capra speaks of Newtonian science, characteristic of Western thought. Newtonian science is limited by the constraints of a faulty ontological premise. These assumptions have been utilized, and even if the assumptions were correct, Newtonian science violates its own philosophy when, as in psychology, it delegates a theory to an area that has not yet been observed. According to Groff, you must start from an observation in your own area, create a theory that seems to cover what you're observing, and then try to make and test predictions. Copper's dynamic balance erases the false separation of mystical intuition and scientific analysis. What we experience are the consequences of the dynamic interplay whose purpose is to affect balance. Balance occurs when scientific analysis is guided by an infinite wisdom, assessed by letting go of our sense of separateness or individual ego and our personality's need to control and compete with nature and the infinite. Only then can the harmonious interrelationships we observe in nature exist also among us, for we shall be one with nature. We must cease to try to understand ego, the personality, and the environment solely through traditional Western measures, and instead focus our perceptions on the energy between them. What we need now is a fuller understanding of an epistemological frame of reference that will provide the unity that contains and transcends all opposites. Western materialism culminates in the modern physicist's examination and conclusion that the material world constitutes the world of appearance, and that the stuff of the world is mind stuff. Despite the allusion to the spiritual material, a fragmented mechanistic worldview remains. Eastern religious philosophies, long concerned with timeless mystical knowledge, acknowledge a reality that is beyond reason, expressible in words, unknowable in the general realm, and inaccessible in a state of non-transistence. Eastern religious philosophies, long concerned with timeless mystical knowledge, acknowledge a reality that is beyond reason, expressible in words, unknowable in the general realm, and inaccessible in a state of non-transcendence. Optimal psychology affirms the creative wisdom of the ancient and modern, emphasizing the unifying principle of each, providing common ground. Psychological theory is, to a degree, shaped by autobiography. The personal history of the theoretician directly influences the articulation of emphasis on theory. This is true of optimal psychology and other psychological theories. From a particular conceptual system, then, we should be able to trace the relationships among personal experience, culture, and the spirit of the times. In recent years, a number of African American psychologists have independently converged on an approach to science of mind and behavior that is rooted in the traditional African worldviews. The Afrocentric paradigm of psychological functioning is consistent with and reinforces the paradigmic shift taking place in the sciences in the West. The Afrocentric paradigm of psychological functioning is consistent with and reinforces the paradigmatic shift taking place in the sciences in the West. And the new philosophy of science. Optimal psychology as a psychological theory adds the dimension of practical application to everyday life. Optimal psychology as a psychological theory adds the dimension of practical application to everyday life. According to Glasser and Strauss, to extrapolate a theory, one generates conceptual categories or their properties from evidence. The evidence is then used to illustrate the concept. That African American experience and that the African American experience in traditional African culture and its correspondent worldview are evidence of optimal psychology is supported by a number of scholars. Dixon and Nichols have been particularly clear in delineating and articulating the philosophical aspects which we are now able to identify in terms of the conceptual system. The optimal conceptual system emerges from the Afrocentric worldview, leaves no room for separation of theory and practice. People live their theory of life, either consciously or unconsciously. Within a suboptimal system, psychologists use their theory of life to create other theories, which they objectify and separate from themselves. Within a suboptimal system, psychologists use their theory of life to create other theories, which they objectify and separate from themselves. If we delineate the specifics of the deep structure of optimal thought and use them to structure reality, the purposes and basic assumptions of other consciousness disciplines will be fulfilled. Walsh identifies 6 characteristics of consciousness disciplines, which can be summarized in reference to optimal psychology as follows. Consciousness is primary. The source of all pleasure and suffering is in the mind. A mind untrained in optimal psychology and optimal conceptual system is vastly less under our control than we imagine, but when trained, provides the means for enhancing well-being and enabling us to contribute to the well-being of others. The trained mind is aware of itself as a manifestation of God, its true nature and identity, and as such uses this knowledge to avoid destruction and suffering. Surviving 300-year, and now we can say 400-year Holocaust, African Americans exemplify the transpersonal nature of an optimal psychology. Through the process, surviving a 300-year Holocaust, African Americans exemplify the transpersonal nature of an optimal psychology. Through the process of racist oppression, we were indoctrinated, often through terrorism, to believe that our physical survival was in the hands of the slave captor. We have been denied the truth about our cultural heritage and history, while the cultural heritage and history of the slave captor has been elevated. To survive the most vicious, extended enslavement in the history of humankind, the African American has had to master his or her mind, see beyond material appearance to a sustaining reality manifesting through our indigenous culture. Our music, as an unspoken consciousness of a people, reflects the full range of our spirituality, creativity, adaptability, flexibility, genius, and at times, dehumanization. Racially, culturally, historically, examining our experience in terms of human triumph over adversity. African Americans symbolize the union of opposites on the continuum of a cultural beginning to the present consciousness. Racially, culturally, and historically, examining our experience in terms of human triumph over adversity, African Americans symbolize a union of opposites on the continuum of cultural beginnings to the present day consciousness. With us, these seeming opposites are unified, contained, and transcended. The Afrocentric paradigm offers a method for structuring consciousness, which, when new to you, is an altered state of consciousness that seeks to unify human finite consciousness with infinite God consciousness. While this conceptual system philosophically characterizes most of the consciousness disciplines, it differs in its assumed methodology and process. Even so, its worldview is by no means exclusionary. It is not surprising that since its identification in the beginnings of human culture and civilization in Africa, this basic ancient wisdom has been found to exist throughout the world. The seeds of ancient knowledge may prove to be the salvation of science and practice in our so-called modern world. Important to the Afrocentric perspective in optimal psychology is the symbol and symbolic. In this regard, the word speech takes on special meaning. From the point of view of semantics and hermeneutics, the meanings and interpretation of words and concepts mark the states of consciousness of the speaker. As we observe the meanings of words and concepts, they change over time and across cultures. We note the unfolding of the consciousness of a people. At one time, for example, Egypt meant black. Jew referred to people who follow God, and Israel, the land of people who follow God. When and how did these meanings change? For whom and why? These questions need to be raised about many important concepts. The answers will tell us something of the nature of the functioning and evolution of consciousness itself. Christ, meaning the Anointed One, represents man or woman, realizing supreme reality or his/her conscious union with God. According to Graves, there are at least 16 crucified saviors before Jesus the Christ, beginning with Horus, the Christ figure of ancient Egypt, then Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, and so on. Each manifestation is worthy of honor and study. From the perspective of an optimal psychology, we appreciate and value the concept of God, God consciousness, as it proceeded from the perspective of an optimal psychology. We appreciate and value the concept of God and God consciousness that preceded the need for a manifestation of Christ to bring people back to the realization of their true identity. My personal experience and cultural background predispose my familiarity with Jesus Christ of the biblical scripture. Yet, from an optimal perspective, the commonality of the teachings of Jesus the Christ with the teachings of other manifestations of the Christ consciousness outweighs all difference. The following is an Afrocentric interpretation of the Lord's Prayer. Our being that is in oneness, inviolable is your truth law. Our realization of oneness be with us. Thy will be done so that we may no longer believe in our separation. Give us day by day our highest good, and grant us relief from payment for our seeing ourselves as separate. For we grant relief to everyone that might owe gratitude and recognition to us. And do not let us be aroused by false hope for false desires of pleasure or gain, but protect us from things that bring suffering. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. A great value in understanding an optimal perspective would be the psychohistorical history of spiritual mind analysis through history, autobiography, biography, folklore, popular culture, and so on, of individual and collective behaviors. The premise of the analysis would be that everything is God manifesting, and it is therefore important to note how the spiritual and the spirit manifest through particular beings. How will spirit manifest through specific individuals or groups of individuals? What seem to be the parameters of behavior and attitudes? The purpose of all analyses is self-knowledge. Valid systems of prediction will be the consequence. In this case, the clear delineation of the deep structure of an optimal conceptual system makes state-specific science probable. The ability to comprehend information thus far is related to the principles of 1, adequatio, or adequateness, and 2, grades of significance. Adequatio requires that an understanding of the knower be adequate in relation to that which is known. For our purposes, a switching conceptual system may be required. In addition, because of the varying degrees of adequatio among observers, a phenomenon may hold entirely different grades of meaning and significance. Learning and practice seem to be compensatory factors that ameliorates the historic problem of knowing and understanding. In our quest for infinite knowledge, we are given infinite opportunity. Experience, learning, and practice result in enlightenment. In our quest for infinite knowledge, we are given infinite opportunity. Experience, learning, and practice result in enlightenment. If we are true to the paradigm, the unfoldment will be accomplished in perfect time. Realizing the divine order, we see that it is inescapable. Divine, supremely good order holds implicit the assumption that all is purposeful, necessary, and that through our conscious and unconscious choices, we create experience that bear witness to the divine plan. Those who have no realization of divine order will likely create what appears to be disorder, a stimulus to seek and reestablish order. Such an infinite wisdom is the divine plan. Consider you. Those who have no realization of divine order will likely create what appears to be disorder, a stimulus to seek and reestablish order. Such is the infinite wisdom of the divine plan. Consider that you, through your consciousness, ascribe all meanings to objects within your environment. Can you perceive and identify the natural energy that flows between all that is? Practice this in order to enlighten your experience through an awareness of perceptual alternatives. The results may surprise you. Thank you so much. Next, we will move on to Chapter 5.
Welcome. So glad you're joining us again today for this conversation. I'm Dr. Linda James Myers, and we have our wonderful elder guest, Dr. Julius Garvey, who's always full of so much wisdom and knowledge. So appreciative of your joining us again, Dr. Garvey.
Well, Linda, it's indeed a pleasure to be with you and to talk to you and to excavate, shall we say, our topic, which is optimal psychology.
Yes, yes.
As you have named it in terms of the understanding of the mind and how we can use that understanding to improve our quality of life, shall we say, as well as our relationships with others in community and also with the environment.
Absolutely.
You know, it's very interesting to look at it also, I think, from a historical perspective in terms of mind, you know, how it is seen, both in terms of our ancestors, which is the original understanding of what the human being is.
Yes.
And the Western understanding of mind, because I think the Western understanding of what the human being is really what mind is.
Mm.
And it's therefore an intellectual understanding of the human being. And I think that's why, you know, from the time of the Greeks, which is, you might say, the original European civilization, you know, rationality and logic and so-called intellect has been so prized, because that was the be-all and end-all of what a human being was all about. You were able to use mind to deal with the environment. And I'm wondering, Linda, just in your opinion too, whether that goes back to the two cradles theory of the up. You know, our ancestors, the human ancestors, ancestors of all humanity, developed in a wonderful environment. As a matter of fact, as you know, the Garden of Eden was in Africa.
Mm.
And, you know, I would say living was easy, meaning that tropical climate and, you know, the abundance of whatever, meaning that all we had to do was to plant the seed. And of course, we developed agriculture. So we were able to feed ourselves, you know. And at most, we had to battle with the drought. But at that time, there wasn't really much in the way of drought. It seemed like the Nile overflew and you know, inundated the lands. And so we had fertile land, we had water, and of course we had sunshine, between tropical countries, and we had food. So life was good, and Mother Nature was wonderful to us. So we had a relationship between ourselves and Mother Nature, and we investigated nature. And if you look at the other cradle, where Europeans developed, it was a hostile cradle because it was the Ice Age. We had been there before the Ice Age, but then the Ice Age trapped a number of us, and we ended up as being Europeans, shall we say, and going through, thousands of years of that hostility.
Yeah.
And having to live by our wits, otherwise you could not survive. And as you know, the survival instinct is major in terms of any animal species, certainly it's major in terms of us. And then we had the other capacity, which other animals don't have, which is to create your environment based on your capacity to think. So I think maybe mind as a priority came out of that environment, as opposed to spirit, which, as you know, is how the African, how we see ourselves primarily as spiritual beings, then having a physical relationship or life, or we manifest spirit in our activities. I don't know. What do you think about the two cradle theory, or what do you think about mind in terms of relationship to our ancestors?
Sure.
And how it's developed in terms of European psychology and everything else, from Jung and Freud and Jung, et cetera, et cetera.
Such an important question, because the reality is we do have two cradles in the sense as we look at humanity. We see people acknowledging African ancestry have historically, from the beginning, behaved very differently than the people who identify themselves as Caucasian or Euro-Western. How do we account for that difference? I think there are a lot of theories. I think the idea of being trapped in the Ice Age makes sense. But even then, we find other people who were also trapped, who didn't take the same route, who didn't adopt the same mindset, who were the people we would consider indigenous to Alaska and the upper reaches of the globe. They were still very communal. They were still very much connected to the spiritual aspect of being. So many ways to think about how that difference occurred. Some would argue that it's a function of that the Neanderthal branch that had remnants left after the movement. So many ways to think about it, but clearly there is a difference in worldview, which I identify as optimal versus suboptimal, and it's clearly cut the Western culture off from that spiritual aspect of being, which would allow them the kind of moral anchoring and clarity that African people have. I tend to not want to attribute it solely to be in a favorable environment, because as I said, there were other people who were in the unfavorable environment and didn't go to the extremes of the total materialistic focus or the competitiveness or the individualism that we see the Caucasian having gone to. But irrespective of why it happened, I think that's a good question to ask. I think it's something we can, and I think it's something that actually Western psychology mainstream has tried to answer. I think Freud's idea that in his observation of the Euro-Western people, he understood that there were basically two drives, human drives they had, and they were sex and aggression. Certainly, I don't believe that's true of all humanity, but I do believe he might have nailed it when it came to the people, the Caucasians and Euro-Western people that were his population of focus. And we certainly see it today in terms of how the cultural group behaves. We have only to look at the fact we have 2 world wars, verging on 3 now, that have basically emerged from their cultural orientation. We have all the evidence that that spiritual aspect of being, which Western man probably, I wouldn't even credit them with calling it or thinking about it as mind. I tend to see them thinking about it more as human behavior. Mind's kind of a step up, and then consciousness a further step. that makes it much more inclusive than mainstream Western psychology has made it. But one of the things we do know, as we have in modern times tried to look at humanity and understand the human psyche, what we do see is that there's a small segment of Euro-Western psychologists who have captured this idea of transpersonal psychology, which is the idea of going beyond individual ego and personality and tapping into something greater. They probably didn't begin to talk about this until the 70s. It's still not made, it's still on the margins of Western psychology, not made it mainstream. But I think what's important from an optimal psychological perspective is our psychology, our understanding of mind, of consciousness has always been transpersonal. We never left our connection to those who came before, the future generations, nature, and the community. So clearly the level of advancement that has characterized African people has just continued to flourish. The challenge, as you know, is our access to that knowledge, because we've been so immersed and brainwashed into the Euro-Western idea.
You know, and very interesting. And as you were speaking, I was contemplating again the business of whether two craze, whatever you think the basis of it is. And what you just mentioned in terms of behavior, you know, I think what I said about a mind in terms of survival, because in a hostile environment, as you know, and we live in a hostile environment, you have to be slick to try and survive within the hostile environment. So you do use mind as a way to manipulate the system, whatever the system is. And if the system is, you know, wild animals are outside, or it's, you know, 30 degrees below zero, then you have to figure out a way to keep warm or to fight the wild animals to get food or what have you. But then you mentioned also the business then that European psychology started out with these different drives, which is very much animalistic, you know, the drive for sex, or the other drive that you mentioned in terms of Freud, aggressive, you know, all of those are animalistic. But then you talk about the gravitation to behavior. And then mind then goes from, okay, we've been able to gratify these drives. Now, how do we have a behavior that will allow us to live together relatively peacefully? So that's when the behavioristic psychology came about. And now you're talking again, now there's been a further transition to a transpersonal type of psychology, which is on the margins, but is trying to catch on. So clearly, again, I would say the Euro-Western understanding is growing or gravitating towards something that is more humane, which is something that we started with. And you came to that point that, you know, this is something that we have had from the beginning. I think it's important to understand that you know, this has been a gradual civilizing of the Euro-Western people. But in the meantime, of course, they have wreaked havoc on the rest of the planet in terms of our humanity, in terms of species, and in terms of just the environment itself, global warming, climate change. And the question is whether it may be too late or not too late in terms of the understanding of this transpersonal approach. You know, this, as you mentioned, also the fact is that our understanding of ourselves and our source and all that has transpired over, you know, 10,000 years, if you will, 6,000 years, if you will, whatever, of our own history. So much of that has been obliterated deliberately deliberately, in terms of books, etc. And also what has existed has been hidden or has been caricatured. For example, that they will call, African perspectives in terms of understanding of ourselves as animist, when anima simply means energy, and of course we understood that right from the beginning. They didn't understand it. I had to tell them that, matter was really energy, slow moving energy, and he gave them E equals MC squared. Well, we knew, about energy right from the beginning, because one of our deities, if you will, was Ra, represented symbolically by the sun. So we understood that the source of life was energy. And they ridiculed it by saying that we were animists. I mean, come on. Everything in nature is animated. If it's not animated, it's not life. So this is the quandary that we are in as African people, because we've been disconnected from this deliberately. And what's there has been hidden from us, or it has been caricatured. Now, granted, a number of our scholars have been correcting this over time. People like John Henry Clark and Dr. Ben, Ivan Van Sertima, Asante Karenga, and so on and so forth. So many wonderful scholars, Dr. Finch, etc. But this needs to be everyday knowledge. It needs to be taught in our universities, and to bring it home to us in terms of a psychology, because and I want you to speak to this, because we've been alienated from this, because we have been miseducated, as Carter G. Woodson says, and re-educated within the suboptimal system. We suffer from so much trauma, mental, if you will, but also, as you know, mental is emotional, which becomes physical. And therefore you have all the anxiety, you have all the fear, you have all the insecurity, and all of these things, turn on these neurohumoral aspects of our physicality, and wreak havoc on our lungs, our hearts, our kidneys, our liver, and everything else. And we have seen in the pandemic how vulnerable we are to infections, because our immune system and our resistance is so low. Can you speak to that relative to the traumatic slavery syndrome, whatever you want to call it? I don't know if you have a name for it.
Yes.
It's with us, and it has been defined by some of us, I think, psychologically. But we have to deal with that.
Absolutely, we do. That's our biggest challenge. I think your reference to Woodson, he was very clear that if you control the way people think, you control the people. And our thinking has been controlled. And he went on to say, you don't have to relegate them to an inferior status. They will seek it for ourselves. To the extent our thinking is controlled, we are relegated to inferior status, because it has been the intention of our captors, our ancestors' captors, and their progeny, our captors, to control our thinking. And part of controlling a people's thinking is to get them to buy into your definition of reality. And their definition of reality, being devoid of the spiritual aspect, has problematized humanity, because we are spiritual beings. So when you cut us off from what makes us fully human, you now have another class of being that is much more, as you suggested, and Freud and others, animalistic in its orientation. Although they think they are superior and more advanced. In fact, I read something last week, I believe, Dr. Garvey, where some scholar was saying, the problem with African Americans and Native Americans, they're jealous of what we Euro-Westerners have done. And I'm going, oh, you really think that? Well, I'm sure at least somebody somewhere is Black and Native. But why would we be jealous? What they've done is brought humanity to the brink of destruction. They've polluted all the environment. They have depleted the resources. They have set up a structure where 1% of the people own 95% of the wealth, and they're proud of that. So I always question whether or not it was deliberate on the part of the elite to control the thinking of all people, not just Black people, but all people. Because if the thinking of even whites or poor whites or whomever is controlled, they will prop up the capitalistic system that is built on the exploitation of the masses. So as long as that mindset, that suboptimal mindset has people thinking controlled so that they are very much committed to, that materialist aspiration, and it doesn't matter how I get what I get materially. What matters is that I get it, and whoever it hurts, it doesn't matter. Whoever suffers from it, it doesn't matter. What matters is me. And that fragmented worldview doesn't help them see that that is so incorrect, because whatever happens to me eventually will filter out and impact everybody. And so for Black people in this society, to the extent our thinking is controlled, we have so much that we've contributed to humanity, to this culture, to Western capitalism even, but we have so little that we have been able to hold on to by virtue of the psychological oppression we've been put under, that will really ground us to continue to move forward. And I think that's really the key for optimal psychology. How do we, coming out of chattel enslavement and 250 years, 150 of fighting for this, how do we keep the spiritual advantage? How do we maintain that aspect of our human beingness that has allowed us to be the moral and spiritual leaders of this nation, of humanity in actuality? And so optimal psychology emerges to go back and fetch that which our ancestors had taught and left the record for, and helps us to re-engage into another construction of reality that's far more consistent with what our ancestors said, but also the height of science based on that fragmented Western view. It's all converging around the same thing. So if we can take our power back and begin to think for ourselves, and that's extremely difficult, as you know, Dr. Garvey, given the oppressive nature and toxic nature and pathological nature of the social context within which we find ourselves. We are just constantly bombarded through technology with someone else's idea of what they want us to think, what they want us to be exposed to. It's frightening with what is the man buying Twitter? The
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk buying Twitter. Elon Musk having $45 billion to buy a social media platform that he can control and step out on the premise that he's understood for a very long time, being a South African. This is another way I can control the way people think. I can control what information they have access to. But the main point that I'm wanting to make, and I think it's responding to the question you raised, this isn't new. This has been the modus operandi from the beginning, from the first African that was kidnapped and trafficked to America to build the wealth of their captors in this nation. Mind control, using your language, has been an essential feature of the Western mindset, the Western idea. I think what that mindset either didn't anticipate or didn't really care about is that the same mechanisms they were using to control our thinking was controlling the thinking of their people as well. And what their people learned is you can lie about anything you want to. In fact, I think it was Trump's person running his campaign who came out with the idea, It doesn't matter what's true. What matters is what you can get people to believe. That is such a dangerous, dangerous proposition. But what is Malcolm said, the chickens have come home to roost.
Mhm.
The problem is that as the chickens come home to roost, we are, as Lonnie Grenier said, the miner's canary. So whatever negative is going to happen tends to happen to us first. And so that's kind of been the model. So the importance of our taking our power back, defining reality in a way that's much more cohesive and coherent and comprehensive and consistent with what our ancestors taught is just essential to our survival.
Yeah, I think that what has been put in place as a system, well, certainly it's racial in one sense, but it's also beyond race, because if
Yes.
you look at the system and you trace it back, there was always a feudal system coming out of Europe. There was always the upper crust, the lords and the serfs, and that has come through, whether it was Greece or it was Rome or it was the British Empire, whatever. There have been revolutions along the way to try to transform that structure. But as you can see, that whole mindset is continuing. So there's a war on the poor in America, in all places, so to speak, that have adopted this voracious capitalist approach, and as opposed to an egalitarian approach. And it doesn't matter who the poor are. You see what their racial component is. They will use whatever. As you know, they came here and they used the Native Americans until they wiped them out, and then they needed somebody else, and they got the Africans, and they'll get somebody else to do it once we're liquidated, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that particular mindset that is there, which is an elitist mindset that you're better than the next guy. And the next guy can, as you know, the world wars were about Europeans killing each other. We got pulled into it.
Yes.
But those wars were about Europeans killing each other. And now we have, the Ukrainians and the Russians going at it with, Europeans behind the Ukrainians, et cetera. So as you say, the behavior has not changed, but it's a top-down behavior. No, we have been caught in that mesh. And what is important for us is to disconnect, and that's why my dad said we must liberate our minds from mental slavery. But as you mentioned, the propaganda machine is so ubiquitous and so persistent. It's 24/7 where you're being brainwashed. So that it's difficult, and especially also, as we mentioned, that our understanding of who we have been in the past, some of it has been destroyed and some of it has been hidden. And we have not yet been able to do that great job of mobilizing that information and using the current technology then to spread that information, because now we're talking, let's say, solutions as we move, well, how did we change this? I think we've been identifying the problem, so to speak, as it exists, and the source of it in terms of whether it's a two-cradle or however the mindset came about. But we've identified the mindset that it is basically at the level of being a very smart animal, I think, to be able to control your environment. To me, that's how I see the Western mindset. And it doesn't matter, who you trample in terms of that, because it's also based on individualism. So as long as I get what I want, then I'm okay. And there's no such thing as community in that sense. I mean, you can put together a community and put together an army if you are, being invaded. But that's the only time you really talk about community, when you're talking about a nation that will defend the people inside from the people outside. But when you talk about what happens within the nation, then is that stratification that you have said and you have identified. The 1% or the 5% owning 95% of the wealth that exists. And despite Ronald Reagan, there's no such thing as trickle down. You know, just that he didn't know that ketchup was the vegetable. You know, he was totally ignorant of economics as well as sociology. I think you know, it's important for us to move in the direction that you've just talked about in terms of allowing the information, you know, to be out there. And that's, you know, part of what we're doing here in terms of trying to identify the sources of our traditions. And that's the only way we can liberate our minds, is if we get to know our traditions, and not only to identify with our traditions, but ultimately, because we have been, shall we say, schooled in the Western mindset, we have to undergo a transformation to become African, if you will, or to become
Yes.
human, if you will, in the fullest sense. This is where I think, you know, we need you to identify how the transpersonal aspect of optimal psychology then can help
Yes.
this individual transformation, which of course will be collective, but you have to do it one person at a time, in terms of each of us has to, shall we say, look at our minds and go into our spirits and recondition ourselves, or at least decondition ourselves, and then allow our spirit to determine, you know, more or less our identity and our behavior.
Absolutely true. In fact, the conceptual incarceration, to the extent our minds are controlled and become conceptually incarcerated, we can't think outside of the box. We can only think in terms of how we've been socialized. Mm-hmm. And we've been socialized not to think, but to take in whatever's been put out. I remember when I was in graduate school back in the day, and there was so much research about how television was going to be a problem for society, because now for the first time on an individual family by family basis, programming could be fed into the consciousness of a people totally unfiltered, because there need not be anybody at home critiquing what's being seen or raising questions. Multiply that by about 1,000 times, because now we're carrying around in our hand little televisions that are constantly telling us or communicating to us, this is what you should look like, this is what you should be, this is what you should aspire to, this is how you're going to be successful. And it's overwhelming. That's why we find suicide among children and adolescents so high, and among Black men as well as Black women, just rising, because that basic sense of peace and value and security we need is never solved by things. And I think that's one of the problems, Dr. Garvey. You don't find the wealthy elites really telling the truth about what it's like to be wealthy and elite. It's not what you think. These people are some of the most anxious, depressed, pain-driven, prone to all kinds of addictions, just to make it through the day, prone to chemical dependency, sexual addictions, prone to all kinds of behaviors that we get snippets of on the news periodically, but we don't necessarily know en masse. This is what happens to people when they achieve at a certain level. I think we were beginning to see it with a young woman who committed suicide, who was so successful. I think she was Miss USA, and she would run some kind of acting award, and was a Division I athlete in high school, and was hospitalized because she was such an overachiever, such an achiever. We don't hear about the downside of success. We only hear that there's an upside. But people experience the downside, but they don't tell people, oh my God, I am so depressed. What they like to do is go on Facebook or whatever and tweet about how wonderful everything is. Well, if it were that wonderful, would humanity be in the shape it is? I'm always struck by how is it that how does Biden find billions of dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars to pay the military industrial complex to fight this war between Ukraine and Russia, but they can't find money to educate the children or feed the children or house the families? That's a reflection of that mindset, that fragmented mindset that's alienated from its spiritual aspect. And it will always behave that way. And it will never, of its own volition, stop. There's never enough. It's never enough. Now we not need to spend our money to go to another planet and see what we can do to mess that up. That mindset has always been one that has competed with God because it's never understood its oneness with the divine. And so we as a people acknowledging and desirous of recapturing our ancestry have to come to the place where we're no longer buying into that fragmented suboptimal mindset and have moved to a place where we are embracing our inherent worth. We are embracing our divinity, and we know it immediately by how we feel. And that's that marrying again of the rational and the intuitive. Am I feeling at peace? Well, if I'm not, my unrest is trying to tell me something. I'm off the path some way. Am I feeling confident? Am I feeling my intrinsic worth as a human being and my uniqueness as an expression of a divine infinite force? Am I pursuing that kind of self-knowledge so that I can extract myself and begin to think for myself, and most importantly, begin to question? We're at this place, at this juncture as a humanity, we have to question everything, and do our own research. Don't just buy into what the major mass media has told us or is telling us. Think for yourself, and then you'll create that which you think. And so all of this is psychological knowledge. And there's so many of us who've been interested in that kind of psychological knowledge production so that we know how to do this. And the first thing I always say in terms of making that transformation process is take the time to do the critical self-reflection so you know what the drivers are in terms of the assumptions and principles and beliefs and values shaping your perceptions. And if you're buying into the Western materialist view, by nature, you are going to be putting yourself at risk to someone else's manipulation and oppression, even if you succeed, because success in this social context is counter to health and sustainable well-being.
Interesting. A couple of things there is that many of us, and I'm not necessarily talking about you and I, but us as a people have bought into the system. And of course, that has been a result of the oppression, very, very severe oppression of the last at least 400 years. And what Carter G. Woodson has told us about the miseducation, and that when you're miseducated, we'll make a back door if there's no back door there. So we see the system as the only way to go forward, because we've been excluded from looking at it in any other way. So with that mindset, then we participate in the system, and it's really sad and disheartening to see how many of us are participating in the system. And not only are we participating in the system, but there are some of us who are a little bit skeptical about the system, but we're still participating. but see that the only way we can go forward is to, quotes, change the system. And we are, quotes, hoping that the system will change. I think one of the things that we have said over the last, a couple of weeks, if you will, is that the mindset of the system goes back at least to the Ice Age and coming out of the Ice Age. And that system has been consistent over time, whether it was within Europe or moving out of Europe, let's say 15th century and so on. But of course, that was the second outpouring of Europe. But we know that Europe became dominant, shall we say, North Africa in the East, let's say 250 BC or something like that, with the Greeks. But this approach to life, to living, to who and what a human being is, has been consistent over time. And it's irrational for us to think that the only way for us to improve our lot is to become a part of that system, and then to hope to transform that system in such a way that we will be accepted into the system. At some level where we be peaceful and happy. I mean, that's totally impossible. If you look at history and you look at anybody's lifetime, it has not happened in 2,000 years or more. So why do you think it will happen tomorrow or the next 10 years, or when the Democrats get in, or when the Republicans get in, or when the communists get in, or the socialists get in? Why would anybody think that the system itself is going to change? Because as we've been saying, the system is based on the mindset. The mindset hasn't changed.
Absolutely.
Where we are is saying that we have to, in a sense, disengage from the system and reconnect with our system, which is the original system of understanding of who we are as human beings and how we relate to the environment. And that is what is missing to a large extent, this living on hope that the system will change. The system is not changing. And if there is some small change, yes, there can be superficial change, which you see there has been superficial change. I mean, we may even get money for reparations, but the system will not change. I guarantee you that fundamentally the system will not change. So, and we get back to what my father said, that we must build our own system, create your own organizations. We can live within the system, but we have to live within the system based on our own principles and understanding of our own humanity and how we relate to each other, so that we build these communities that you're talking about, where we can manifest our Africanness as members of a community, and not just as individuals isolated and competing with each other, and who has the most toys when they die. That's certainly not a program for peace and happiness and prosperity or anything like that. And as you say, it shows itself if you look at all the statistics, in the United States in terms of health and so on. And of course, I have practiced medicine and so on and so forth. And, I would say just about all of my patients, certainly by the time they get to 60, they're on 5 or more pills. And, more than 60% of them are overweight. They have aches and pains, and they're certainly not aging gracefully. It's complaints and this and that and so on. And there's a pill for every symptom without understanding the cause of the disease process. And the cause very often is mental and the mindset, which is hostile to the environment, even hostile to yourself, hostile to your husband or your wife, hostile to your kids, and so on and so forth. So it's totally dysfunctional. You mentioned the kids.
Totally.
Kids don't know which way to go.
Absolutely.
There's no system for them to go except compete and become an entrepreneur. The big word of entrepreneurship. What that means is you get a business, you try to outcompete the next guy, and you end up very rich, like like Elon Musk or you know, what's his name? The other guy, Bill Gates.
Bezos.
I mean, you know, is that an aspiration for life? I mean, not. That's not an aspiration for human beings. The aspiration should be to become human, to become
Absolutely.
fully human. And I think that's where we have to go in terms of talking about how do we make that transformation. You started this in terms of talking about self-inquiry. And the whole idea is looking at self to gain self-knowledge and self-understanding and then self-transformation. But there has to be an understanding that there's more to life than just the gratification of the
Yes.
five senses on an individual basis. And then everything is competition for the goodies in terms of how many of the goodies you get in gratify your five senses. And this has to be understood so that the individual has to come to a point in their own life where they say, you know what, this isn't working. Or, as you have been saying, I've seen the system, of the way in which the system I feel are working in the system. There must be another way. You know, many of us have had the midlife crisis. I know I went through that to some degree. But whatever level you have it on, whether you're 20 or you're 40 or you're 60, you have to come to that realization that this is not optimal. And I love that word, optimal. This is not optimal. There must be another way. And then we have to have an understanding of the other way. And the other way has been around for, you know, at least 6,000 years. And
At least.
that has to be brought to the fore because there's a method to self-inquiry. It's
Yes.
self-analysis, it's the science of mind, which is not understood in the West. Of course, you know, now there has been over recently, let's say in the last, 30 years or more, an understanding of meditation, of mindfulness, and so on. Certainly it started with Zen Buddhism, etc., which has become, somewhat popular, largely in the yuppie population, but then has somewhat spread. So that there has been developed a tradition, if you will, maybe not a tradition, but an acceptance of mindfulness within the American population. And this is good because it is gravitating individuals and groups towards a better understanding of themselves.
Hopefully this is going to be the outcome, but I think our challenge is what you talked about in terms of the foundational mindset, the system that keeps us oppressed, and that foundational system to structuring human consciousness and human experience is the conceptual system. It is buying into the conceptual system that the powers that be hoist upon us that keeps us in bondage. We have to somehow look at our own conceptual system. Are we buying into the materialism, the competition, the individualism? Are we really believing the only way out is to get our piece of the pie? And do we have to buy in it to the point where we realize this pie is not only stale, it's toxic and destructive. Unfortunately, I'm hoping that people, given the level of dysfunction of that Euro-Western mindset, have at least taken the blinders off and are able to acknowledge these people are trying to reverse every gain that we as Black people have made in this nation. They're trying to keep us from voting. They're taking our rights away. They don't even want their children to know the truth about our history, or our children to know the truth about our history. At some point, Dr. Garvey, we have to stop and say, hold up. What are these people about? And you point out so eloquently, they have their system has never changed. It started the same way it is now. It's just that if there were any covers on or any, the veil is being lifted, we must begin to see that conceptual system that they want us to buy into is leading us and leading humanity to destruction. But the optimal alternative that our ancestors have left us is the one that helps us to see that another conceptual system, which says, I am one with the source of all good, that I am one with all those people who came before me, those who will come after me, nature, my community. I have no identity separate from all those interconnections. And I can only do as good as all aspects do. There's no way I'm going to be thriving and healthy and successful and the environment's gone to kaput. No, nature and I are one. Yes, we are one. And so hopefully as people through your efforts, and I am so happy about the Garvey network, because now what we have to do is create platforms and spaces where we can teach people the truth about who they are, about the history, about what's been going on, about, most importantly, how they can transform their own consciousness. And so at some point, what we're doing and what we're attempting to do with the Garvey network and with creating Mindful Mondays and our conversations is to create space and the opportunity for people to hear something differently, to follow a different path, not the path that's going to lead to destruction, but the path that has the potential to elevate the entire humanity and bring us back from the brink of destruction.
Beautiful, Linda. And I certainly look forward to our conversations along this route, shall we say,
Yes.
as we examine mindfully, how we can transform our minds, if you will, and ultimately ourselves, going to the source, which is consciousness, and that we are manifestations of consciousness, conscious activity, physical as well as mental, and to show also how that ties in with science, because there's been a dichotomy between so-called religion and science, or between any understanding of mind and consciousness and science. But as you know, quantum physics has shown that consciousness is primary, even before energy and certainly before matter. So I look forward to us exploring, those areas and dealing with the methodology of self-inquiry and how we liberate our minds from the mental slavery that we've been encompassed by. So thank you for this, and I look forward to it.
Thank you as well. Thank you as well. And thank our audience. And I suggest while we, before we come back next week, think about the intelligence of the heart.
Yes.
Because that is going to be so key to getting us where we need to go.
Mm-hmm.
In the Western mindset, there's intelligence and then there's emotion. But what the height of the science, neuroscience, and quantum physics, our African cultural tradition said, no, intelligence of the heart needs to be the driver. So may your heart elevate and illuminate in intelligence until we meet again. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much.